As much as we live in the liberated space age of 2020, there's still a lot of censorship. But there's one type I think you're seeing more of now than you ever did before. Self-censorship. When the creator of something censors their own work, usually pulling it from distribution and stopping people from seeing it at all. Until recently, scrubbing your own work from existence was extremely costly, not least of all extremely irritating for people who just want to watch it. But like literally everything else, the internet makes this all a lot easier. Before the internet, there's only really a few rare instances of self-censorship like this. One above all stood out to me, and that was a Clockwork Orange.
Due to YouTube's terms of service, some fannies have been replaced by twats.
A Clockwork Orange is the most disturbing film ever. And I stand by that even now, even though it's been many years since I originally saw it. I actually rewatched it in preparation for this episode, and my judgment still stands. And I've seen plenty of horrible, grim, depressing, dark, morbid films in the interim, and Clockwork Orange is still the king when it comes to uncomfortability. Sure, there's no gory violence in this. This and Texas Chainsaw Massacre are the masterclasses in implication. But the atmosphere built, the feeling you get watching it, and the uncomfortable nature of it all makes it pure horror show. It's also at points extremely quotable and absurdly hilarious.
You know what you can do with that watch? Stick it up your ass!
Good.
Which makes that uneasy feeling even worse, because there are moments in the film that are almost too disturbing to really want to describe.
Food, alright.
This scene being the worst of them all, obviously. Without spoiling the plot too much, the story follows a teenager called Alex, as he terrorises a seemingly anarchic, visually arresting Great Britain, where he can do what he wants, when he wants, however he wants. There is way more to it than that, and rest assured it's not just grimness for the sake of grimness. Eventually the film goes from being very violent into being a discussion about violence instead, in a very nuanced way, with some very difficult answers to go along with it. Oh, and this guy who gives one of the best performances ever. It's beautiful, horrifying, provocative, thought-provoking, and also manages to tie you in as the viewer in some very interesting moral knots. I think you can probably guess already, but when this was released in 1971, it was a little bit controversial. Shockingly, the BBFC, the people who cut bits from films over here in England, passed it uncut. This was during a brief period where a lot of boundary-pushing films got through the censoring ringer, in a weird bit of liberalism that we didn't really see again until the turn of the millennium. This decision to let it go uncut resulted in a surprising amount of backlash for the then head of the BBFC, Stephen Murphy, who was targeted by some extremely concerned film producers and distributors who thought that he was single-handedly flushing morality down the toilet. Naturally, when Clockwork came out uncensored, and even the film industry itself were having second thoughts, so did Mary Whitehouse and her army of censorious, coffin-dodging droogs. Naturally, this just encouraged a lot of people to see it that wouldn't have anyway. But then, some crimes started happening. If you're my age, or slightly older, you might remember that people used to come on the news and say that Grand Theft Auto was going to cause kids to kill each other. Essentially, what we're going to talk about today is the same exploitation of tragedy. An onslaught of gang crimes in the early 1970s began to drag A Clockwork Orange's name in the mud, even if almost completely unrelated. Frequently cited ones include gang fights, where members of them claim in police interviews that they saw A Clockwork Orange, or their defence lawyers claimed it, after the fact. A murder that happened to take place the same day that Clockwork Orange was being screened somewhere on the other side of the city, and a manslaughter case where it's revealed that the accused boy didn't see the film, but instead read the book a long time before the manslaughter occurred. Understandably, the film's director, Stanley Kubrick, was not happy with how the film was being received, and so he did the unthinkable. Ban the film where he lived. Which was here in the United Kingdom. Not any other country, mind you. He doesn't live there, they can just all fall apart. He was particularly concerned about both these supposed copycat crimes and several threats made towards him and his family. There were pickets outside his country home in Hertfordshire. It was getting pretty serious. Still not a justification for what he did, but you know, just want to put the devil's advocate side out there. Warner Brothers didn't pull it. The government didn't ban it. The BBFC were actually keeping stum and wanted to keep it out there uncensored, which is not very them in the 70s. It was Stanley Kubrick himself, and it stayed banned by Kubrick for the remainder of his life. One of the most popular films of the early 70s, internationally, and here of course, and with one of the most defining performances of a generation, just suddenly wiped and unavailable. This was also way before you could actually own copies in your own home. And even when you could buy any sort of horrible video nasty on VHS, you still couldn't buy a Clockwork Orange. Stanley Kubrick, as I said, pulled it from distribution. You couldn't get it in any way, even as the decades progressed and home video releases became the norm. You couldn't see it in the cinema, and if your cinema showed it or tried to show it, you could risk a massive fine. In 1993, a cinema in London called The Scala tried to show it and were immediately sued by Kubrick's people. In the decades that followed, the best you could hope for was an imported video from Europe or a bootleg taping, both of which were hard to come by. It was quite a rare, cool thing to actually have seen it in this country, better yet to even have a copy.
The first time I ever actually saw the film was in the early 1980s. I went to somebody's house and they just got one of the very first video recorders, which at that point was like the size of a small settee. And the first thing that happened was somebody turned up with a pirate copy of Clockwork Orange. And of course, by that point, I mean, I knew the book really well, I knew the music really well, I'd seen the stills on the back of the album, I'd read all the scare stories about how it was this terrible thing. Finally, you were going to get to see it. What we actually saw was a very fudgy, fifth generation, almost entirely orange copy of the video with, I think, Japanese or German subtitles. And even in that terribly degraded state, it seemed to be something exceptional.
Even though the on-screen violence was quickly surpassed by slasher films and the like, it was still stopped for the remaining 26 years of his life. About a week after he died, the Scala Movie Theatre, which now bounced back, rushed to show it. And by all accounts they did, and good on them. And by 2000, everyone could see it on this home video, which I don't own anymore. So we can now enjoy a bit of the old ultra-violence at home. The idea of it being banned at all is a distant memory now, to people my age anyway. I feel like this story is a great defence for why you should separate art from artist. A Clockwork Orange, 2001, Doctor Strangelove are all flawless masterpieces. But the ban was petty, pointless and neurotic, and there's no getting out of that. I'm sorry, but even though you made 2001, this doesn't excuse this bad, damp mark on a largely flawless career. Well, I said largely flawless.
Try the